When I have all those scenarios completed, I have the feature completed. Therefore, what exactly is it that I'm describing in my tests? I'm describing features. What is a feature? It's part of the program. It's part of the specification. What am I defining in my test? I'm defining the specification of the system. The documentation. The Word document that we all write, that we get the customer to sign, and that it's obsolete the moment we start working on the program. We all write that specification. Nobody goes back and updates it. You might during the first month. You might want to keep things in sync. But on a 6-month project, the last thing you're going to do when you deploy is say, right, now let me examine the code and go and update the Word document so that the specification matches exactly the code. We don't do that. Why? Because it's not staring us in the face. Whereas if we're describing the specification, the features, the scenarios with code, it is staring us in the face. If a feature changes, we will change it in our code. Because the last thing we want to do is run a test that fails and the code that it's implementing has nothing to do with what the test is describing. It hurts. It's wrong and we fix it. It's like calling a method something and it doing something completely different. So we have ubiquitous language, which is eliminating the communication mismatch between customers and their developers. We have eliminating testing terms from frameworks. Having compiled specifications. That is specifications that you can actually compile. Right? We have focusing on business value. We're asking the right questions. We're saying, why do you need this feature? And we're defining these specifications during these sit-downs with our customers. And if we throw all that into one bowl, that's what we're trying to accomplish with BDD. So when you think about it, it is nothing more than using tests as functional, compilable specifications, but not limiting it to creating cryptic computer terminology, but using test names to describe context, to describe business value, to describe the actions that we're performing. And that gives us something else apart from validating functionality. It now gives us documentation and specification of the system. So those of you that say unit tests no longer, they're not that important because I write bug-free code every single time, apart from needing help, you see that now unit tests are not only about validating things working, they're not only about having a regression test, but they're also about specifications. It's about specifying my system. It's about getting rid of that Word document and using code to describe my system. How can I do this today? It doesn't matter what you do today. BDD is not about tools. If you do unit testing today, you use MS Test, stop. If you use NUnit, XUnit, MBUnit, JUnit, all of these are fine. They're all great. They all work. So, does it matter what tool I use? No and yes. No, because the concept of BDD is about communication. It's about describing things. It's about talking to the customer. It's about adding business value. It's not about the tool. However, the tool does help in that communication. It does eliminate some of the barriers that certain tools impose. Like, for example, the problem Dan North had, which was JUnit had too many words and terminology focused around testability. And JBehave eliminated that. So, you can use a whole bunch of tools. I'm going to show you two examples. One is with Spec, and one is with SpecFlow. How many of you use SpecFlow? How many of you use Spec? That's even. One guy uses SpecFlow, one guy uses Spec. Well, I use Spec, so that's two. We win. Okay? So what is SpecFlow? So there is a Everyone here is a .NET developer, right? No Java guys, no? Any Ruby? Right. So there is a tool in Ruby. You've heard of Ruby though, right? Okay. There is a tool in Ruby which is called Cucumber. And Cucumber is a way for us to describe tests like this. If we go down to here, or I won't say tests anymore, I'll say specifications. Don't you just love PowerPoint? Why not from the slide I am at currently? It allows you to define features like this. And it produces compilable, although in Ruby there's no such thing as compilable, but it produces code. It produces Ruby code. Okay? Now the language that it uses to describe this, you think Cucumber is funny, the language is called Gherkin. That salty stuff you put in your sandwiches. Right? So SpecFlow is a port of Cucumber and Gherkin to .NET. You don't have to actually use, you can use Cucumber directly via another thing, which is another project which is called Cuke for Nuke. And then they say the developers aren't weird. Cuke for Nuke is like a socket server that listens and is an it's a pipeline between Ruby and .NET. So if you want to use Cucumber, you can with Cuke for Nuke. If you don't want to use Cuke for Nuke, you can use SpecFlow. And there's others. Everyone now is inventing their own framework. Okay? It's not about the framework or the tools, it's about the concepts. So here I have an ASP.NET MVC application, right? And I have the default templates. And when you install SpecFlow inside Visual Studio, what it gives you is a bunch of add-ins, and it gives you some file templates, etc. So you can now go to File, New, and actually it wouldn't be File New. Let's go right-click, Add, New Item, and you see that I have a SpecFlow event definition, SpecFlow feature file, and SpecFlow step definition. Okay? So when I add a SpecFlow feature file, what I get is this. You see that it has syntax highlighted. Okay? So basically it's taking the same image as I have here and using that to describe it in code. Okay? So here's one I have from earlier. Login. The feature I'm about to implement is called login. In order to access the system, as a user, I want to log in. So that would be equivalent to this top box over here. Right? And then that top box gives way, in my case, to two scenarios. Valid credentials. Given I provide a valid username and password, when I press login, then I should be redirected to homepage. Now Cucumber has support for AND. And this guy does too. This already tells us one thing. That in a normal unit test, normally they say a best practice is to what? To only test for one thing. With BDD, when you're describing a system, often you can't decompose it into individual parts. Why? Because BDD is about outside in. It's about taking the system and describing it first from top down, from the user interface. Okay? So here I'm describing the user interface. And if my user interface, when I log in, has to redirect to the home page and send an email, I need to capture that in my scenario. I need to capture that in my feature. Because otherwise, I'm not conforming to the specifications of the system. Okay? Last scenario is invalid credentials. Given I provide an invalid username and password, when I press login, then I should be displayed a message indicating invalid credentials. Those are my two scenarios. Now if we run this, I hooked this up to NUnit, which is not hooked up anymore, but this runs inside the NUnit console. and it will say to me, this is all not implemented. So the next thing I need to do is now implement this, because all this is doing is describing the feature and the scenarios, but there is no code. How do I, as a developer, now use this so that I can compile this and implement it and validate the functionality? That's, in SpecFlow, you use what's called the steps. So the steps are arrange, assert, act. So I have a class which is called logInValidSteps. So you see that a step corresponds to a scenario, not a feature, right? And then I have the given, the when, and the then. This is for regular expression matching. Basically what it does is that when this runs, it checks to see that this part matches exactly the line that's been written in the scenario. Because if it doesn't, what does that indicate? That the scenario is describing one thing and the test is doing something else. It generates this for you automatically. When you run this code, basically you set up a login feature, you set up a feature, describe the scenarios, hit run, and it will spit out some C# code saying that these steps aren't implemented. The normal flow is to copy that and create a login steps file. And then you fill in the blanks. And that's great until you need to modify the feature. Because then either you've got to overwrite it or manually come and update the expressions. Okay? So that's a gotcha you've got to watch out for. But all I'm doing here really is just arrange, act, and assert. See the similarity between this and a unit test? Arrange, act, assert. The difference here is, however, that I'm using business terms, UI interface terms to describe the system. And now I have a functional specification, which I can compile and I can run, and it can tell me if it's passed or it's failed. By default, it sets up context, scenario, current, pending, which means that when you run this, some test runners will give you a yellow, others will give you a red saying that this isn't implemented. Okay? That's SpecFlow. Now, when you show this to people, they're like, this is great. Do you like this? Right? Show this. Now, don't fall in the trap of saying, oh, you know, my world just opened up. Now I will just tell my customer to write features like this, give them to me, and I implement it. The key in BDD is questions, is communications, is asking why. If your customer is going to hand you the features for you to implement, then you're just what? A lazy programmer, right? With the same problem you had before, which is miscommunication. So don't ever look at SpecFlow or see that as an advantage. Okay? The disadvantage to SpecFlow is that as you change things, you need to update things. And personally, I don't like it. Don't know why. I don't like lamb burgers either. I like lamb leg, but not lamb burgers. There's too much information. We don't care. So this one is what I use, right? And this is called mspec. And mspec uses lambda expressions. Hold on, let me just switch something else so you don't see that.